Oh, do you need the discussion plan?
Wait.
Yeah. Oh, it's fine. We're not ready to replace Dave. Are we live? But we're not recording yet.
Should be, yeah.
We are. Okay, wonderful. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. We have just an investigation review tonight. We won't have vice chair elections this evening since we did that last week.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
exactly.
This is very disorienting. I thought we did that.
And
It's beauty.
Right.
right.
I wasn't here. I don't think they took place.
Do we have contested? Contested election?
I don't even get to vote. So.
Well, I don't think that was our intention, but we will honor
Congratulations.
and celebrate later. So welcome everyone. We have members of ACPD here. We have a visitor from Richmond's Civilian Review Board here and some members of Arlington Public Safety Office. And then we'll welcome folks online as well. Mami, happy Eid and thank you for joining us remotely. We're missing you, but glad you're able to be with family.
Thank you, Eid Mubarak. And sorry for not being there in person. We usually don't know when Eid is going to be until like the day or so before based on the sighting of the moon. So it's hard to kind of predict the schedule. I appreciate y'all's flexibility.
Oh, we're just delighted to have you, as always. So we'll go ahead and do attendance and then previous meeting minutes. Do you have those up in?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, Commissioner Montgomery.
Here.
Commissioner McCullough.
Here.
Commissioner Smith.
Here.
Commissioner Ortiz.
Here.
Commissioner Miller.
Here.
Commissioner Evans. Here. And Commissioner Dean is not here yet, but we have a physical quorum, so we'll go ahead and get started. I know sometimes he gets stuck in traffic, so hopefully he'll join us. Okay, so I think we just have last meeting's minutes to approve, so we'll look at those quickly. But did anyone find anything that I didn't see any errors or corrections? Questions? See, we have a record of the uncontested election.
Okay.
It's in the minutes. Great. So I have a motion to approve the previous meeting minutes.
I so moved.
Second,
I'll second it.
all in favor, aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay? Any abstentions? Wonderful. We can adopt the meeting minutes. Okay. Tonight's investigation review was led by me and Anika. We have the Office of Professional Responsibility report and the Independent Policing Auditor report. I'll go ahead and give a kind of summary of the circumstances and the alleged policy violations. I'll let Anika weigh in before we hear from Mami and Albert, and then we'll do discussion before we make our recommendations, and then both. Any questions? Great. So this incident took place at an apartment complex where the complainant was sleeping in their apartment undressed when two maintenance workers entered the apartment. The maintenance worker said that they knocked and didn't get an answer, but the complainant was startled by the arrival of unexpected visitors, and there was an altercation then at the rental office between the complainant and the staff. So ACPD responded to the complaint and received the body-worn camera footage shows that the conversation between the manager and ACPD, who described the circumstances and said that the complainant kind of bumped chests with them on their way out and lifted their gown exposing themselves kind of on the way out. And then ACPD had a subsequent interaction with the complainant in the management office where the interaction did not get off to a positive start. I think both parties were talking over each other, and there was some contention when ACPD asked the person to identify themselves, and they refused to do so. They weren't able to get that information from the policing office attendant either. And so they were having a back and forth conversation about kind of what was going on, and ACPD asked the complainant to sit down. But during the interaction, it's just kind of a very counterproductive conversation, I think, on both sides. And at one point, the complainant steps forward towards the officers, and this is in a small space. There was kind of a note that the complainant was physically larger than the officer they were interacting with. There are two ACPD officers present, one kind of primarily leading the interaction. And that in that conversation, the complainant stepped forward, also stepped back and set down their phone and drink to kind of free up their hands in a situation where our kind of initial considerations here are that the description of the events from the manager, while the manager did say that they wanted to press charges for assault and exposure, the description of the event didn't seem violent in nature. It seemed kind of defensive or immature more than a significant threat. And then the pre-assault indicators, which we reviewed for the behavior of the complainant in the situation where they stepped forward, again, they did step forward and kind of close the distance between themselves and the officer in a small space, but it didn't appear to be a kind of threatening gesture from our perspective. Same thing with setting the phone and drink down, that, you know, freeing up your hands could be a pre-assault indicator, except that in this instance, from our perspective, the next gesture from the complainant was to kind of put their hands together in a gesture that seemed very not violent. So ultimately, there's a little bit of a back and forth. The complainant is released without arrest, and on their way out of the office, yelled a profanity and said, "Defund the police," where the officer who'd been leading the conversation said, "You know, get out of my sight and feel the same about you." So the broader context is that this person was being evicted from their apartment. And in our review of this case, it's, I think, important to recognize that the complainant, as a non-binary person, identifies as kind of a member of a vulnerable population. The circumstances of eviction mean that, you know, this is kind of a situation of economic hardship, and that unexpectedly finding people in your apartment under any circumstances is kind of alarming. So I think our assessment of the interaction was that there was a lack of maturity from both parties, and that the conversation could have on multiple fronts been approached with more constructive participation. But during the interaction, the ACPD officers asked the complainant to sit down multiple times to kind of facilitate a conversation, and the complainant refused to do so. So in one of the requests to have the complainant sit down, ACPD said, you know, sit down or you're going to be placed in handcuffs, and quickly did put the person in handcuffs for not sitting down. And then that's where the rest of the circumstance took place. The rest of the conversation took place. So we're looking at 3 alleged policy violations: 1 for personal contacts, 1 for duty responsibilities, and 1 for bias-free policing. In our discussion plan, I think we have the, well, maybe we don't have the policies printed out there, but you know, for the ACPD kind of distinction between personal contacts and duty responsibilities being what the officer said and how they conducted the conversation. Duty responsibilities dealing more with how their duties were carried out in like execution. With bias-free policing, we're looking at instances of police involvement that are initiated by some sort of stereotype or bias. And so we'll talk through kind of each of those specifically in our discussion, I think. I'll let Mummy and Albert weigh in before we take questions from the COB and have a broader discussion. Oh, thank you, Ian.
Well, thank you, Mummy.
Oh, yeah. Mummy, would you like to add context or additional comments?
Sure. Also, for some reason, I don't have access to the share function, so I normally share my screen with the policy highlighted, but it's in the chat if anyone wants to reference the policies that we're talking about with personal contacts, duty responsibility, and then the third one I'm going to put in the chat right now is the bias-free policing right here.
You have shared permissions now, Mummy.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. The Teams has become high security these days. Okay, so starting with personal contacts, which is 414 right here. So I agree with the I agreed with the kind of fact pattern that you laid out there, Julie. I think that both for personal contacts as well as duties and responsibilities. And I'm specifically speaking to Officer 1 because there are two separate officers that were involved in this encounter. Both of them were interviewed as subject officers. This kind of verbal altercation or what took place between the two of them, the initial recommendation was to exonerate just by reviewing the body-worn camera footage. But I felt that it was important to call both officers in, specifically Officer 1, to unpack a little bit more about why they made the decision to place the complainant in handcuffs. And so that's kind of what the interview process was about and what was, I think, kind of the central piece for the duties and responsibilities piece. So personal contacts, that part was kind of more so looking at the verbal interaction. Although just as a caveat, I don't necessarily agree with a blanket categorization as personal contacts as verbal and duty responsibilities as action, because sometimes verbal verbal contact can rise to the level of something that compromises the fairness and the professionalism of your duties. For example, how you are interacting with someone during an interview, during a detention, if that rises to the level of, just being unprofessional or unfair, or also if the words that are being said are threatening or something of that nature, I think it could rise to a different level of, either a different policy, conduct unbecoming, or different things like that. Or as we saw in our last investigation, there was an allegation that someone verbally said something that was sexually offensive or harassing. And I think that although that was not sustained or that was exonerated, I think that categorizing it as personal contacts does not quite fit the bill. And that was something that should have been investigated as something more than that. So just to kind of highlight why I think that distinction needs to be made, or we should always be looking at personal contacts to decide if what was said verbally was just, rude, or whether it was something that actually rises to something more serious or potentially something that actually compromises the duty. So I just wanted to kind of share some thoughts there broadly. I don't think that was the case in this particular situation. I agree that I think the interaction was just very poor communication between the complainant and the officer. I think the complainant was trying to get their point across to the officer, and the officer was more interested in performing kind of an investigatory interaction, getting that person's name and getting that information out before just stopping to allow that person to let off of their chest what they had just experienced with someone coming into their apartment, barging in while they were asleep and, not dressed, and how, what type of trauma that might have inflicted on that person. And so I think what then happens is this kind of back and forth where, they're both kind of instigating the situation. But I think when I'm looking specifically at Officer 1's conduct, I think had that officer utilized better soft skills and just listen to that person for a few seconds, that whole interaction would have gone completely differently. Because when you think about the complainant walking into the office, the complainant also thought they were victimized. And instead they were treated, from their perspective as someone who was under criminal investigation, which they were. And so that makes sense. But, the soft skills pieces as an officer, understanding that there's two sides to every story. And although you may be looking at that person as a suspect, they in their minds may be thinking, I've been victimized and I want to be treated as someone who needs help as well. So just kind of allowing, obviously, based on the circumstances, if it's a much more violent or tense circumstance, you obviously are going to use your judgment and not, approach it in that manner. But in this situation, I think there was definitely room for that. And I think that Officer One instigated the situation by basically going very much tit for tat with the complainant, and it just escalated further and further and further. So for that reason, I could not comfortably exonerate the officer because I think they contributed very much to the escalation of that interaction. It didn't quite cross the threshold of sustain for me, only because I think because there was, verbal kind of verbal responsibility, I guess, if you will, in instigating the matter on both ends, versus like other investigations that we've looked at where the complainant, for example, was in his car just asking, why he was being pulled over, and then the officer was, very rude and used profanity towards him. I think in that situation, the complainant was clearly like no culpability. And in this situation, it was a little bit different. And so that's why I couldn't necessarily say sustained either. I don't like how the interaction went down. I wish that the officer had handled it a little bit better. But, looking at it just from a, technical standard of preponderance of the evidence, I thought not sustained was the best finding for that, or the most appropriate finding. And it's the same thing for duties and responsibilities. And for the duties and responsibilities, I focused just on whether or not the officer was acting fairly and professionally when they put the complainant in handcuffs. On the one end, I think that to the officer's credit, the space is enclosed. The complainant is substantially larger in size. They do seem to be a little bit amped up. And, they asked the complainant to sit down. But I think the result of them having to ask the complainant to sit down is kind of a carryover from the whole, escalated verbal exchange. On the other hand, so there is, to finish that thought, there is some, credibility to, I wanted them to sit down to kind of control the situation and keep it from escalating physically further than that. But I go back to, there are ways to control a situation that just are soft skills, and de-escalating using your soft skills and not having to rely on force or putting someone in handcuffs. And that's why I said, I think if the first part of the interaction had gone differently, we may not have even gotten to someone being placed in handcuffs. From the complainant's perspective, they believe that they were put in handcuffs simply as an exertion of power, an abuse of power. Basically, like, since you're not going to listen to me, or you're not allowing me to control or lead this communication, I'm going to place you in handcuffs, which could very well be a possibility as well. And the reason why I say that is because I think that the way that the complainant stepped towards the officers could very well just be, from my objective perspective, they're not communicating well. And the complainant may be thinking like, you're not hearing what I'm saying. Someone just walked into my apartment in the middle of the night and this happened, and your response is showing me that you're not hearing what I'm saying. So I'm going to step closer to you so I can engage with you better because you're not hearing what I'm saying. I think the way the person stepped towards the officer was more so like, no, you're not hearing me, versus an aggressive manner to try to, kind of exhibit those pre-assault indicators. Again, all of which I think could have been really mitigated effectively with some soft skills and some de-escalation. But for all of those reasons, for duties and responsibilities, I think there just wasn't enough evidence for me to exonerate. So I found that not sustained, or to sustain, I found that not sustained was the best appropriate finding there, because in a not sustained is basically there's not enough evidence to either prove or disprove the allegation. And then finally, for bias-free policing, similar to other investigations, I think that there, based on how the situation was escalated, and also the complainant explicitly said they felt that they had been treated a certain way because of their non-binary status. Not comfortable exonerating because of the fact that there was some escalation on behalf of the officer, and we have just not reached the level of delving into bias-free policing allegations in terms of the administrative investigation to where I would feel comfortable exonerating. Similarly, I wouldn't feel comfortable sustaining because we're just not asking the right questions to really delve into whether there was an actual potential bias beyond just a yes or no answer. So for that reason, I would not sustain on Officer 1. For Officer 3, I actually did exonerate for all 3. And the only reason why I felt comfortable for 1 and 2, that the second officer just really didn't have much interaction with the complainant at all, just kind of playing backup. And I also thought that there were some indicators that Officer 2 was actually trying to diffuse the situation. Particularly, I wanted to commend and highlight that Officer 2, once the complainant was in handcuffs and kind of sat to the side, instead of standing over the complainant, he sat down next to them. And I think that helps to kind of show a sense of, equality and humanity that I would personally appreciate if I were in their shoes, somebody sitting across from me instead of standing over me, especially if I'm in handcuffs and already feeling kind of like I don't have control over the situation. And so I think that there was some soft and nonverbal skills that Officer 2 used that I wanted to just highlight and commend. And for those reasons, I exonerated 1 and 2, and also 3, because in this situation, as opposed to what I just said, for me, Officer 2 was never the highlight of the bias-free policing allegation or really the subject of that. So I was comfortable exonerating just based on the behavior that I saw Officer 2 exhibit during the encounter. There wasn't anything that I felt, as opposed to Officer 1 who kind of escalated the situation. I didn't feel that Officer 2 exhibited that same behavior. So I exonerated all 3 allegations for Officer 2. And lastly, I touched on kind of this throughout my discussion around personal contacts. I definitely think that there should have been some training recommendations made here. I'm not sure if the department has already undertaken any sort of training that was kind of outside of what occurred in this investigation. I certainly would love to hear, I'd let them speak to that and hear anything about that, but it would certainly be my recommendation that Officer 1 undergo additional training on soft skills and de-escalation. And just, as I said, to emphasize, department-wide, that soft skills and de-escalation can be very strong and very effective alternatives to using physical force. And then I already kind of talked about, from a policy perspective, where I think there should be less of a black and white distinction between personal contacts and duty responsibilities, and for us to kind of look at the circumstances a little bit more in determining what's the appropriate allegation there. So that's what I have to say about this one. I'm happy to answer any questions if you all have any.
Thank you, Mummy.
Can I?
Yeah.
Mummy, just a clarifying question. Can you cover your findings for the bias-free policing for both officers? Again, what were your findings?
For Officer 1, not sustained. For Officer 2, exonerated.
Thought I heard something else. Thank you. That's great.
Thank you.
And then one more comment.
Yeah, sure.
In particular, it was highlighted in the report that you mentioned overall officers' one account of the incident was mostly consistent with what was observed. This is in particular around the duties and responsibilities.
Mm-hmm.
It was mostly consistent with what was observed in the body-worn camera footage. However, the IPA found that the officers' one account of the complainant's behavior to be more aggressive than what you observed within reviewing the footage. And you did say kind of subjectively. I think the way that I interpreted it is that it certainly is very much a subjective statement. And I think that there needs to be an understanding that if an officer feels threatened, then we ought to consider that statement and their actions based off the behavior.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. Whenever I assess kind of, the facts with what's on the body worn camera, or even address, the kind of credibility piece, I like to just use that part of the report to unpack any perceived inconsistencies, because similarly, people could watch the video and see the officer's account during their administrative interview and think that they are being, disingenuous. And my point in pointing that out is that the officer's level of threat, to a certain extent, is, very much subjective. I think it would have to reach a certain threshold where it's just it is a credibility problem. That was not the case in this report. And if I ever do find a credibility issue, I will, say I find, this reaches a level of, lacking credibility or diminished credibility. But I do like to kind of explain, what the officer perceived versus what I perceived from an objective perspective. But also, as it pertains to perceived threat levels or aggressiveness, I think those are very much subjective. However, there's a piece of that too that, from a foundational standpoint, officers are instructed. There's instruction around that in certain, we mentioned earlier, pre-assault indicators that they are required to kind of take and apply to the factual circumstances. It's just it's kind of a mix of the two, in my opinion, because despite how much instruction, in the classroom an officer gets and whatever the, standards or elements are, or indicators are, nobody can help but putting their own personal perspective into how they assess a particular situation. And it's so circumstantial based on so many different factors, that person's life experience. In this situation, I think even the stature played a factor into it. So there's some objective and some objective pieces, I think, when assessing, threat level or aggressiveness. And I just like to try to highlight both sides of that.
Thank you. And we'll talk a little bit more about the kind of perspectives. I want to give Captain Kim a chance to share his inputs.
Okay, well, thank you, Mummy. I'll go ahead and get started, and then I'll just kind of go through all the policies that you went through, and then I'll open up the floor if there's anything to add from the chief or the deputy chief. So let's talk about personal contacts to begin with. And I think one of the points that you made, which was, verbal interactions, yes, we consider them personal contacts. But is there a time and a place when that verbal encounter with a complainant can rise to a level beyond personal contacts as an allegation? And the short answer is yes, absolutely. If you do something that is above and beyond, like so egregious that it is not hey, I just got mad at this individual and I said something profane to them. It goes beyond that. That is a completely different allegation unto itself. And we will basically provide that allegation and investigate it for that allegation, right? So yes, I do agree with Mummy on this, that there are verbal encounters that go beyond personal contacts. But then when we talk about a little bit of back and forth, which is what happened here, does that rise to that level? I'd be like, no, this really kind of stays in that level of personal contacts. So I think what also Mummy mentioned is that there's this poor communication between the officer and the individual. It doesn't work out the best. And then there's some statements that you made at the end, that the officer made at the end of that encounter. Okay, so here is my mea culpa, which is basically like, I can be convinced that this policy allegation of personal contacts for Officer 1 could be not sustained, right? I would not sit here and say, no, it's exonerated. Absolutely. You can convince me that not sustained could be an appropriate finding for this particular allegation. So that's a way of me saying, yes, I see it. I can see what you all are pointing at. I recognize that fact. Absolutely. And so, we'll just leave it at that. That is not the way that we saw it in this case, but I can totally see it the other way as well, if that makes sense. And then before I move on to the other ones, I do want to open the floor to nothing. Okay, so let's talk about duties and responsibility. I know all of you all were provided probably the most important thing, which was this training piece of paper that I said pre-assault indicators. And I think I let you all see that. And it's important to understand that that is not a comprehensive list of pre-assault indicators. There could be many other things that officers pick up on when dealing with a complainant and determining whether or not they are like imminently about to assault them, right? So I did note, and I did find that some of these things during the interview of both officers, they actually do mention, and that I observed, actually, I wasn't there at the time, but I actually observed this while this interaction is taking place, like, you know, keeps moving around, there's some tension, and then I think one of the Officer 2 says during his interview, I noticed the complainant intently staring at Officer 1. And he picks that up as a pre-assault indicator, right? Looking at an officer staring them up and down. Then additionally, I noticed, and then I think Mummy noticed, and Julie also mentioned that there's 2 items in the hands at some, like while they're talking, all of a sudden the items go on the counter. Okay. And so I have been assaulted many times, unfortunately, in my career. And I understand that when that normally takes place, people like to free up their hands because they want to grab something on. They want to grab my vest. They want to grab my radio. They want to do something, but their hands need to be free. So that is not listed on here, but it's clearly a pre-assault indicator. The other thing is, if you look to that second piece of that chart, it talks about how do we avoid assaults in general, right? And so that little branch tree that goes out talks about position, movement, and using your environment to create distance. Well, when you're in a small environment, that is not afforded to you, right? If I'm in a small room dealing with an individual who's much larger than me, I cannot necessarily position myself. I can't move because the room has a finite amount of space. The environment is actually working against me in order for me not to be assaulted. And so that was what played out in this particular case. There's a small room. There's an individual who both officers acknowledged during their interview that there is non-compliance and that there is some aggressiveness that they are observing during this encounter. I wasn't there at the time. I wasn't in the room. I can't pick up on those things that the officer. I get that I'm looking and we're all looking at it through the video, but we can't pick up on those things. The officers, both of them said, yes, we are picking up on these things. And so they see this perceived aggressiveness and then make a determination. I can't move. I can't reposition myself. I can't have them sit down, which is, according to Officer 2 during his interview, a way to mitigate the possibility of anyone getting assaulted. When I have someone sit on a chair, it contains their movements and restricts their ability to move around. I can't move, right? Because the room is small. I'm going to make it harder for the individual to move around by having them sit down. That option is not being afforded to those 2 officers. So the only option left then is, if you pick up on these things and after you've given plenty of warning, is let us do this handcuffing thing to contain this person. And that is what takes place here. And this is a long way of me saying that, yes, in this case, the actions of the officer are consistent with our training, the way that we teach things, and the things that I'm observing on the video. It's all consistent with those things. Okay, and then before I move to bias-free policing, okay. All right, last thing, bias-free policing, and then I'll just briefly touch on training. Bias-free policing. And so, and Amami and I have been, and Julie also have been communicating at length about finding ways to sort of make sure that we are getting to the root of resolving whether or not there was some bias-based policing going on. So I've had multiple communications with Mummy about this, trying to work together to figure out, hey, what would be some appropriate questions to ask? Like, how do I resolve this to the satisfaction of the COB, satisfaction of OPR, and then make sure that it's fair and that it's reasonable for everyone to be like, oh, okay, these are reasonable, fair questions that get to the root of the issue here. And so we've all been sort of brainstorming and noodling through this process. And so with that being said, like, yes, that is something that we are continuing to work on actively together, and I'm happy to continue to engage in these conversations as we move forward through this process. And so, lastly, I'll talk about, I just want to check it. I want to cut it out. So, lastly, I want to talk about personal contact, soft skills training. Okay, so. And I think I mentioned this in a previous investigation review. In 2021-ish, the department went on this whole big, huge, like, I guess, what should I say? Move or like process program to develop this soft skill training. And that became a very robust program. I believe we did it quarterly. And so those things, that training, that soft skill training foundationally started in 2021. It is reinforced in all the quarterly trainings that we do with our officers. Our officers are required to go to in-service training for control tactics, for firearms, but then for some like other things, which traditionally the police department has not necessarily provided training for. So recently, I think right now, everyone is going through the training of, what was it called? It's basically suicide awareness training. And so we spent a great amount of time of going through this. And although we might say, well, that benefits, you know, maybe wellness and officer wellness and making sure that our officers are safe or whatever, but you're picking up other skills when you go through that 2-hour training too, right? It's how do I pick up on these cues? How do I talk to people? How do I have these tough conversations? What's the best way to manage this? If someone that I'm interacting with, a member of the public, is making mention about something that I think they're going to harm themselves, what is the best way to do this? This is all part of that foundational soft skills training that the department continues to move, push, develop, and have every single one of us go through, to include the command staff, because I believe all of us were in that training not too long ago. And so these are things foundationally that we continue to build on. When we do our scenario training, right? So all these, what I call these manual skills, like, you know, control tactics and taser operation, firearms, that's all part of the scenario. The scenarios that we built are all developed to have an outcome that ends in a non-arrest, if that makes sense. So like, if you build a scenario and every time the scenario, the logical conclusion of that scenario is either shoot the bad guy, tase the bad guy, arrest the bad guy, then you're doing your officers a disservice, because that simply does not happen every single time we interact with someone. There has to be scenario outcomes where the proper outcome is, no, this person was simply asking you for directions, which is actually a scenario that I recently read. This person just walked up to you and wants to know how to get to the grocery store. Okay. Do you draw your gun? Do you like tase it? No, of course not. That is not the desired outcome. And so this is a way of inoculating our officers to different outcomes other than the tool that they're being trained with. And that is an important feature that we continue to do, an important part of the programs that we continue to develop. And so with that, I think I've pretty much covered most of the things that we talked about, and then I'm available for questions here along with Chief and Deputy Chief.
Thank you. Before we open it up for discussion, I want to just share something we talked about in one of our recent kind of debriefs was, you know, in our review of this information, I think, you know, we do have the opportunity to place ourselves in the perspective of the complainant, place ourselves in the perspective of the responding officer, and then adopt our kind of official capacity as the community's perspective. You know, how do we want these scenarios to be regarded, handled, you know, enforced in policy, updated? So Jim, I appreciate you kind of drawing the question to, you know, the officer's perspective. And I think we did, we were grateful for Albert sharing more of the department resources. I certainly, in my first viewing, was not attentive to some of the pre-assault indicators. So, you know, being able to put on that hat and where the small space, somebody bigger than you know, aggressive behavior is definitely, you know, part of kind of considering what outcomes, you know, what outcomes can be avoided, what is the best possible outcome, and where, you know, we have current policy thresholds, right, where we still have discomfort, that's where we have the opportunity to be proactive. So Anika, I want to see if you want to add anything to the scenarios or just kind of reflections from your review of the evidence before then the board can ask more questions and we can have a discussion.
It's amazing because y'all all say, oh, I was like, Dad, what am I going to say now? Like, especially with what Jim brought up as far as the officer's perspective. Because like you said, we always look at it from as a civilian because we haven't gone through the training. However, we we had several conversations about just I guess that would be towards the bias-free policing as far as the comment that was made, because then that probably is what triggered the complaint of, as far as when now they were in the wrong as far as saying a profanity or whatnot, but the police officer responding back to it. So just more of stressing, and I'm sure you do, of just not being easily triggered, that you go tit for tat for members within the public, especially members of protect, a vulnerable class. And so we won't, have to be here, because in reality, the space, everything you just named, it was like, okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. But it's just that one little area of professionalism and not tit for tat stooping to their level, and just stressing more of that. And so we don't have to be here for that particular type of scenario.
Mhm.
What else?
Well, I was gonna say, we can maybe go through as a group and discuss personal contacts first, and then we'll get to duty responsibilities, and then we can do bias-free policing.
Yeah.
But
And then the placing in handcuffs, is there I don't know how I feel, like I'm kind of mixed with this. I have to handcuff you to get you to comply, kind of thing, especially when the scenario. Did they really have to put them in handcuffs? Because the way the interaction was going, did they really have to handcuff? Because
well, I want to say, in our review of this, the duty responsibilities question, our focus was, this goes from, we're having a kind of heated discussion, to you're in handcuffs, which, to the point of, like, we've asked you to sit down so that we have some higher level of predictability about what you may do. I recognize that. I think, initially my review, and this discomfort kind of sticks, that there was, while there were repeated requests to sit down and to identify themselves, and there was non-compliance, in the final request, it was a pretty quick, like, sit down or you're gonna go in handcuffs. And it did seem kind of retaliatory to the behavior to me, more than it seemed to me to be a response to the pre-assault indicators. I think, while I recognize that the officer's input in the interviews is very helpful in adding the context of, did two officers independently have the same perspective on this? The complainant's perspective is that I'm perturbed by this unexpected disruption. I'm already frustrated. I've already had an altercation, and I'm standing here with two officers in a room where, the numbers are not in the favor of the complainant, launching a violent or that kind of response. So I am mindful that we weren't in the room, we weren't the officer. This is a small space, and the body-worn camera footage doesn't give us sufficient context to look at that. So I think to me, the duty responsibility question, while I'm a little bit uncomfortable with how quickly, we went from sit down or you're going in handcuffs, there were multiple requests to sit down. There were multiple requests to identify themselves. And so that this kind of repeated non-compliance, there does seem to have been a need that, in order to have a constructive and focused conversation, that detention was justified, and from my view.
Yeah, I think being asked for your identification, everyone knows that that is a very normal interaction. If an officer asks you for ID, that's a normal question. Everyone without any training knows that. Right? I mean, it's
I think it's a normal expectation that you're going to be asked for identification.
And then when you decide to make a point to say no, then it leads down a path of where this led.
Well, but to Mummy's
it was
point,
but it was not an unreasonable point.
Right. But to Mummy's point, that, like, this, in an effort to de-escalate the situation, this person was clearly worked up. And I think that the pre-assault indicators, the behavior later on, that from the beginning, there was an opportunity to take a different approach to the questioning, that, like, if you're not getting a good result, don't keep trying the same approach. And that's, to me, where, like, the repeated non-compliance wasn't wasn't unavoidable, maybe with a different approach, but I do think that in order to facilitate an effective conversation, it did seem like, the detention was necessary to get this person to kind of cooperate and participate in a discussion about the facts and not the fact that we are interacting.
And going forth, just throwing it out there as far as they already felt that they were violated themselves. They're in the rooms now. This is in hindsight of how about they're in the room with the people that they felt violated them. At what point they could have just separated them, and so it could more fair and balanced of let's get yours out here versus them being handcuffed and told do this, do that in front of the same people that they felt victimized by. So if the officers would have came in and been more, not that they weren't 100% neutral, but just more of a stance of let me remove the two parties and get your perspective over here. So you don't feel like everyone is just jumping in and saying you're wrong, you're this, you're that, you're the violator, all these different things. And then it's being done in the same area of the people that they felt that they were being victimized.
Although didn't the manager start to come in and then he went back
But it
out?
was the other female was still sitting at the desk.
Right. But
I don't
she had
know
gone
that they
to
were involved, that the person sitting at the desk was involved in the entry to the apartment. I don't know that was the same
Yeah, that
person.
wasn't my understanding.
I think that was like the.
I know they were, but they're part of.
Right, the part of the organization,
Yeah.
sure, certainly.
Yeah.
And I do maintain that, like, if I woke up and somebody was in my apartment unexpectedly, my like level of being angsty and frustrated and disturbed would be much higher than I just walked down to the office under other circumstances. Like, I think that's pretty human. I don't want to wake up with people in my room. Yeah. So for personal contacts, I think, I am struck.
Yeah, please. I'm just brushing what's being said. I would say that, to kind of elevate part of what you were saying, a lot of it broke down to, yes, it's a reasonable question. If you're questioning someone who, it's a reasonable question to hear if you think that, oh, I've done something wrong, and they're asking me the thing that you ask someone who's done something wrong. There's, if I'm wrong, they're gonna ask me my ID, they're gonna ask me to do this. But I think you're on to something that this person didn't feel, they felt like they almost had just as much right to call the police on whoever these people were that came into my unit. So I could see how, in hearing a question that otherwise would be the question that you would ask, that's fishbowling it. Oh yeah, that's the question you ask of that person. But of that person, I could see how they would be like, why are they asking me this? Hold on, no, you got to hear my story. You may be asking them what their ID is because they're the person who has who's really done something.
But I don't think the police often ask for your ID just because they're setting the stage to understand who is who and what's going on. I don't think that they only ask for a person's ID if they think you've done something wrong necessarily. I mean, I think the problem, as Julie said, is it's a very agitating thing to have somebody come into your home. It's very violating. And so, of course, that individual's mindset was in a bad place. This is where Mummy's correct about soft skills and understanding that they're coming into a difficult situation. But I don't think that it was unreasonable for them to ask for ID. And I do think that it was I do think that this pre-assault stuff does make sense to me. And it's hard to tell on body-worn camera because we're not there and the perspective is a little distorted when you're looking at the body-worn camera. So I give it on that, but I do think that the soft skills, and I think someone, perhaps you, Julie, had said there was a bit of immaturity, and I think that there's just a little bit of immaturity in these cops. They're not as seasoned, perhaps, as some other cops that are.
Well,
there was a lot of back and forth that didn't necessarily have to be there.
Sorry?
There was a lot of back and forth that didn't necessarily.
That didn't have to, that was not
that
constructive. It was just not constructive, and they should just have stopped it.
Right.
And they And I liked Mommy's pointing out also the officer who sat down,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's a person who's starting to understand that that this is an individual and I need to talk to them as an individual. So, yeah, I mean, it's a complicated situation, but
And to that point, the body worn camera footage of that officer, looking at that, it's interesting because I can't say as though that conversation was largely more productive than the other one, but the tone
Right.
that it took didn't elicit so much aggravation, you know?
Well, and I want to echo Mummy's kind of commendation because that officer has been involved in other situations with a very similar pattern of showing up with the kind of de-escalation and proactive soft skills that have made difficult interactions between members of the public and other officers. Like that officer's participation kind of routinely shows up in that way. And I do want to commend that their, involvement and their approach, routinely is that way. We're focused on this incident, but if it were the opposite, we would probably comment. So, in this instance, I think it's relevant that that regular presence. Now, I think as we get into kind of the demeanor and coming back to personal contacts, in addition to being agitated, and especially if you're undressed at home and you feel kind of violated and agitated, not by ACPD, but in this situation, as ACPD coming into this, we have to learn to understand the perspective of people who routinely interact in regular conversations with normal questions, and as a non-binary person feel like they are treated differently by society. And that even in situations where that's not actually the case, there's a sensitivity because they're kind of used to it. And so to me, when I look at what I see as immature behavior, from the initial description of events of like, lifting up your gown and walking away in public, or the kind of the defensive demeanor in the interaction, I can't empathize that if I feel kind of like I am a regularly bothered person in society, that my threshold for being asked for my ID when I feel like I'm not being heard, and that's where I do wish that there, was an attempt to try a different approach.
Right. It's not it wasn't the question. It was
right.
It was the totality, the circumstances that surrounded that person getting that question in that way.
And we've talked about this, like any member of the public could come into a situation with ACPD and be agitated. And that's kind of to be expected, where ACPD, generally holds itself to a much higher standard. In this instance, I think had multiple opportunities to uphold a higher standard. And so, for personal context, to me, the real crux of the issue where it comes to a level of disrespectful is in the final comments, kind of in the going out of, get out of my sight and we feel the same way about you, where, specific comments that they were completely unnecessary, right? But they were also kind of specifically targeted in a personal way that I found disrespectful. So.
Okay, this is a sidebar. Some places, some citizens, and I don't know how Virginia's actually, sovereign, and people feel that they don't have to provide ID. How does Virginia or even Arlington handles that when someone feels that they're sovereign and they don't have to provide ID and all this stuff? How do you combat that, or what's
the standard?
Yeah, what's the standard?
We worked with the county 3 or 4 years ago. We used to have a failed ID statute, and it's been repealed. However, if somebody's,
What does that mean?
it's no longer existent.
Oh, no, what is a failed ID?
Failed ID, like the law used to say that if an officer asks you for your identification, you have to provide at least your name and your address. I think those are the two things. And, it's a misdemeanor charge, and that's no longer in existence. However, if somebody's involved in a criminal investigation and officers have to document it, we have to, with some level of certainty, if you tell me your name, I need to work. If you don't have an ID, I need to work with you a little bit so I'm comfortable that I'm writing down the correct name. If you're giving me somebody else's name, that can have ramifications for the person. So, it can lead to obstruction of justice in certain scenarios, but the goal is really just to get the person identified so that we're not creating bad records.
Mm-hmm.
So, it happens all the time where somebody doesn't have an ID. But, what's your name? I tell you my name, and 9 times out of 10, if it rolls off your tongue, like, okay. But if you're starting like, what's my birthday?
Right.
It's a little bit more of a conversation because, you know, we don't want our records to reflect that Amy Penn has been involved in 27 incidents with this again.
Mhm.
So, you know, it's normally pretty easily worked through. Not always.
Yeah, thank you. So my last input on personal contacts echoes something we talked about previously where, you know, I guess part of my sensitivity to coming from the interaction with the leasing office, the person in the leasing office who had this interaction and the person who filed the complaint against ACPD is that the eviction process is kind of the motivating thing here, right? Like they're going into that because this person is being evicted. And I think the police have an obligation to both community members and our businesses. But in this instance, right, like there's not an urgent threat or a severe something that can't be mitigated. And so I would like to see the same kind of approach to the kind of vulnerable and kind of distressed community member as much, if not more, than the kind of business interest where I recognize that the person in the leasing office said they wanted to press charges for assault. But again, even from their description, it just did not strike me as, you know, something where, you know, somebody bumps their chest at me. Now that's a personal threshold and I can't weigh in on that person's decision, but I did feel like the approach with empathy was just not kind of from the jump. And so maybe that takes us into the bias-free policing conversation, but I don't want to shut down anyone's.
Do we know if that person did actually file, you know, go to the magistrate?
I don't believe so.
No.
I don't believe.
I mean, it's after the fact, but.
Yeah.
I mean.
Well, they would kind of be in the wrong because it's not even ACPD that do like involved in like eviction stuff. That's like sheriff department and stuff. So they was already in the wrong by even walking in. They were supposed to go through the court system to do all of that type of. So they were actually like in the wrong. So
If I'm following the information that I read correctly, because this was something that I was thinking about, the eviction actually had already, the sheriff, I believe the process with the sheriffs have already took place. I believe they were actually there because the time had come when the person was the unit was actually supposed to be vacant at that point. I don't think it was actually to serve the original notice. The original notice had been done.
Yeah.
And they had reached the time period where that particular unit should have been absolutely vacant.
and then that's the sheriff department that still does.
Sheriff's department was to put the notice on the door and to make sure that person got it. That's what my understanding is. How I'm reading it. That all they were doing there was to make sure that unit was gone,
Well,
was empty.
well,
Not that the eviction notice was put on the door.
right. But whether or not I should not be in that unit and need to vacate it and maybe I need to be assisted in vacating it, right? Like I'm here, I'm not supposed to be here, fine.
Yeah,
but
that was not to what you were saying. That was more so to where we were in the process. That you are correct, that the notice should be served by the sheriff's office, and by my reading of what was there, all of that had actually played out.
Gotcha.
This is the part really where it would just be on the landlord to just say, okay, well, that person should be, oh, let me just open up this door. Now, could that have played out in a slightly different way? If you think that person's there, if there's indications that that person's still there, then that could have played out, differently than just sending people in. And, by the fact that, but everything beyond that, I'm supposing then, what they knew or did know, they did send 2 people as opposed to 1. That may have some indication that they may have thought that someone was there or not, but I don't know.
Well, I could expect that it would be useful to have 2 officers when you're evicting someone because again, you're expecting that if somebody needs to be removed, they may behave erratically. So I follow that completely. I think we've kind of covered the nature of the interaction between ACPD and the complainant.
So just to clarify, they were called there to investigate the report of an assault as opposed to eviction. Right. I mean, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult situation. I mean, police are called upon to do so many different things, right? I mean, so many different skills, physical skills where you're actually physically at risk, soft skills. I mean, it's a hard job. And this is kind of a case, to me, it was on the bubble in a lot of respect. And for the way I saw it in terms of the arrest, or not the arrest, but the detention, was that it was a little bit premature. I mean, when I first looked at it, I'm like, I don't think she had to do that. So that to me was like, well, could it have been done better? Yeah.
Yeah.
But is it within the policy, which is where I think we've, that's the real question, like, second guessing as opposed to outside the policy. And, the factors were helpful. I think with two people there, I think it was unlikely. And my view that this guy, of course, it's in hindsight, but my view was he didn't look like he was about to assault her, but particularly with two officers there, but it was a small space. He was a larger guy. He was upset. So, I mean, I think it falls within, but
People are just irrational. They don't know this person. They don't know that this person's going to act rationally.
the police.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I
Like,
agree.
you wouldn't attack somebody.
I
at
agree.
all
So that's why I'm
until
saying
you
my
know
second,
they're two police, but-
guessing is,
Exactly. So,
right.
I mean,
I
it's
get
like,
that.
from that
Well, and
perspective,
absent this, yeah,
it's just too hard for us to say.
Yeah,
I mean,
no, I agree.
They couldn't possibly have known, for sure. There were enough signs that I think.
And he was a difficult person. I mean, and to me, that goes to.
the-
individual.
yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry.
They,
You're right.
yeah, they.
Yeah. Yes, they were a difficult, I thought, I mean, with response to the question about the identification, I mean, my sense is that is something most people would say, okay, although it's interesting because I actually had a situation where my son was arrested and he was asked for identification. We had previously told him that you don't have to answer any questions, and I was unaware of the ordinance that says you need to, and he got arrested. So be that as it may, not everybody understands that. But even so, I think most people would. My point here is that I think his response was pretty antagonistic on almost all of it. I mean, he was pretty fired up about it. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Hey.
Well,
Right.
I think we probably agree, and maybe we should give our recommendations, but I do want to talk about bias-free policing. I think, from the duty responsibilities, the like a little bit premature, but repeated noncompliance and the need to change the occupation of this space from standing, at close distance with, enough movement and tension, that the detention being justified. For bias-free policing, again, we're looking at kind of whether or not bias is a factor in initiating some of the actions. And I also wanted to comment, Captain Kim, I appreciate your input on the building scenarios to promote non-arrest outcomes, right? Like that as part of a focus of soft skills, I think is, kind of specifically what's valuable here. So I appreciate that. And I do support Mummy's recommendation that this officer kind of get to that. But I guess you're saying that's, department wide, which is valuable. When we look at bias-free policing, we have talked, as Albert said, about, how do we explore bias effectively? This is something that, probably having external input can be helpful with. I would love for the COB or the IPA's office to have more time to do that kind of research and, best practice on a national scale. So that's something we'll kind of keep in our queue to prioritize. I think absent input from my challenge with Officer 1 related to bias-free policing is I didn't get a specific threat from the I think that the initial complaint as reported by the person in the leasing office sounded to me to be a very immaturity based reaction. I'm frustrated that this process is complicated, not I feel like I was unsafe or I was injured or I was something. And so I can't say that bias didn't impact this officer's attitude because I think there was a lack of empathy for a person that seemed to me, while I wouldn't say they were being difficult, I would say they seemed extremely defensive and they seemed extremely heated. from not feeling heard. And that, opportunity changes when, they're having a more focused conversation, but there's also not specific evidence to indicate that their actions were motivated by bias. So, and officer 2, I don't think there's any behavior to indicate that there was an influence of bias in their interaction. So I think we can make our recommendations and then see if there's additional discussion.
Sorry,
Please, no, of course.
So a couple things I just want to point out, the training piece, I mean, I understand everybody involved has different feelings that are happening at the time. Training is one of our big commitments, and even with our staffing crisis, and don't hold me to the number, we just did this with the budget, but we had about 60,000 hours of training last year. That's despite the staffing crisis. And like Albert said, all the training does focus as an element of really focusing on de-escalation in it. And I think it's equally important to point out that our training also, all the way from the academy, is very pointed in that, when we arrive on a scene, an officer has to make it safe for everyone there. And that is trained from day one to make sure that, we have a job to do. We go into it not having really any idea other than what the radio told us. So we have no idea who's who, but the first focus is, how do we make this safe for everybody so we can ask the questions we need to ask, figure out what happened, what didn't happen. So I would just ask that you consider that piece too, because that is a big piece of training all the way through. But, we do as much training as I think we possibly can do. More is always better, but 60,000 hours, and that includes our basic training, but that's a lot for an agency our size. And a lot of places I think have had to cut back training, and we remain committed to it because I want our staff to be prepared to deal with whatever comes our way, whether it's tactical, whether it's soft skills, whether it's de-escalation. So we are and will continue to be very committed to the training piece. But I just wanted to add that one piece about one of the first things an officer will look to do when they get on a scene is make it safe for everybody. And, because they walk through the door having really no idea.
Yeah.
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just quickly jump in as well? Thank you, Chief Penn, for helping to bring this back out into a broader lens. I think overall, this investigation for me is not, when I looked at the big picture, it's not something that I think is that discipline helps with. And that's why I think I really was, I really felt like not sustained was most appropriate, because I don't think what this officer needed was discipline. I think what they needed was just better tools. Because I think, all the things that they did could be tactically justified. And I think even though, I think even that being said, what we're talking about here, just from this particular situation, but also just broadly in the work that we're doing here, is trying to promote better human to human interactions, and not necessarily to promote, more and more discipline, unless it's warranted in a particular situation. But I just don't think that this was one of those situations where I think this officer would have walked away as a different or better communicator by just being disciplined specifically. I think the training is really what is needed here, is better tools, more effective communication, more effective de-escalation skills. While it is certainly, while within an officer's right to ask for a person's ID, if, the kind of underlying reason for that is to make sure that administratively they have, the right paperwork, or even just, from a policing perspective, that they have the ability to check and make sure that this person isn't maybe wanted for something else, or, just it may be a more of a nefarious situation than what's initially presented. All that being said, when you just strip this down from a human level, this complainant is walking in wanting to just tell their story. And, the officer interrupts them, telling them what happened, to say, "Where's your ID?" And the person responds "Okay, I just want to tell you what happened." And they just keep, this back and forth of no, I want your ID. And that communicates just on a human level of like, I don't really care about what it is that you want to say right now. And that's where I think like the escalation begins to happen. And that's where I think like it's about not necessarily are you tactically or, legally or whatever permitted to ask for these things, but more just about having the emotional intelligence to understand the value of timing. And I think this whole situation, I believe, would have unfolded differently if they had just said, I'm really sorry that happened to you. I want to make sure that you have the opportunity to tell us everything that happened. Just understanding that there are two sides to every story. Obviously, circumstances are, sometimes different. If they had walked into the office and the manager had a bloody face and, it's clear that that person had been attacked or what have you, then, obviously the kind of need for them to get that person's ID and just get down to really controlling the situation a little bit more aggressively would be different. But if it's sometimes a he said, she said situation, which might be, or he said, she said, they said situation, you just never really know what actually happened until you actually hear what happened. And so, it could be as simple as, hey, we're going to get everybody's IDs here, and then we're going to figure out what happened here. And, ultimately nothing actually even came out of this. So it could have just taken a second to just redirect the conversation to say like, hey, I hear you. I want to hear what you have to say. I'm really sorry that happened to you. It sounds very upsetting. I just need your ID so we can, make sure we fill out the proper paperwork or whatever. Explaining to someone why you're doing something, understanding the timing and the value of timing, making sure that someone feels heard, I think makes all the difference in a situation. And I don't personally think we'd all be sitting here today discussing this matter if the interaction had happened that way. So for me, the focus of all of this is training, not just for this specific officer, but from a department-wide perspective, as Captain Kim highlighted earlier, just continuing to reinforce those tools and make sure that officers are utilizing those tools effectively, I think is really where we make the most impact here.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that perspective. I think coming into recommendations for office. Oh,
just one last thing since we're on 3, and just to underscore, very happy that Mummy, you and the department are continuing to have conversations about how we ask during the OPR portion of this. Bias. The question there was, were any of your actions based on bias? That was it. Yeah. That's the question, and that was it. Nope. Okay, and we can do better.
Yeah,
we can do better. I'm glad we recognize we can do better than that. And I look forward to seeing. Well, hopefully we're in a situation where we'll have to see those questions being used. But if we are, right, I look forward to when similar allegations are made and investigated, that we do have a healthy approach to really getting to that. So I'm glad you all are working.
Well, and one of our recent conversations was about asking open-ended questions where the answer doesn't come back as a yes, no, because it's in the answer that we have the opportunity to address like sincerity, understanding, defensiveness, obfuscating in the same way that officers kind of do that in their, interactions with the public. So looking at recommendations, just for expediency, I'll say our recommendation for Officer 2 on all 3 was exonerated. I don't think that there was any behavior there, non-conformant to our expectations of the policy. For personal contacts, we recommend that Officer 1, the violation be sustained, not dealing with the initial engagement and the lack of de-escalation or empathy, but really that the tail end of the interaction where there was an unforced error, right? An unprompted, well, not unprompted, but an unforced error of there was a good opportunity to just, let this interaction be over. And instead the officer chose to make comments that were not just disrespectful, but could be interpreted as specifically biased and saying, we feel the same about you, where I think we do as a community have to acknowledge that the threshold for respectfulness of vulnerable, community members is higher. But I would feel that way regardless of this person's, gender identity, because I think we can expect that officers are able to withstand heckling or criticism from the members of the public that they're interacting with. And I think ACPD does hold a higher standard. And in this instance, the officer fell short of that higher standard. And so our recommendation was that the personal contacts violation be sustained, that the duty responsibilities be exonerated for Officer 1, the detention was justified, and that for bias-free policing, Officer 1, that it be not sustained. For lack of evidence that there was a specific bias influencing this, but enough kind of tension and difficulty around.
Okay. Sorry, just before we go into voting, I've been instructed to take my glasses off. Before you guys go into voting, I'd recommend that you vote per officer, just for purposes of clarity.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you.
So for expedience, maybe we can vote on Officer 2. Well, before we do that, does anyone have questions about the exoneration on those 3 policy violations? We vote on that as one decision. Okay, I will hear a motion to find Officer 2 exonerated for all 3 policy violations.
So moved.
I'll second it.
Wonderful. All in favor, aye. Aye. Any opposed, nay. Abstentions. Wonderful. Okay, then we'll just do these one by one. Personal contacts, the recommendation being to sustain the policy violation. All in favor, aye. Oh, sorry, I'll hear a motion.
I'll make the motion.
Let's have some more. I'd be interested in
let's discuss.
further discussion about that, because I'm really on the fence about that one.
Sure.
I mean, I agree that at the end, the officer sort of, didn't do what she should have. She, got down in the mud and threw back at the individual and said, yeah, I feel the same way about you, which is pretty disrespectful.
But
because-
also get out of my sight.
Right. Get out of my sight is actually pretty bad. For me, I'm sort of really right on the bubble of like, it's either for sure not sustained or it's a sustained. There's no way to exonerate because that was inappropriate behavior from the officer. I mean, the discussion of where the complainant came from was helpful. My first reaction was that person was really just difficult, but I hadn't really thought through, and I started from the place thinking that they shouldn't be in the apartment in the first place. And that was where the leasing manager was coming from. Like, this person, assaulted me, but I'm not sure who was right or who had the legal right, whether that they had the right to go in there and say maintenance and all that stuff. I mean, it was jarring for the complainant, to have people come all the way into your bedroom. I mean, that's freaky, I admit. So I can understand why the complainant would be upset.
I think you should read because if you read it, I hear what you're saying. But, if you just think of it, because we're doing personal contacts, right?
Yeah, and the policy language I'm excited on is respectful.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I think if you're just treated in the way that it says, treat all persons with respect and not use degrading, profane, abusive, defamatory language, blah, blah. I mean, when you look at the entire thing, yes, you could say this officer, was not the most mature and could use more training and all that kind of stuff. So there may be extenuating circumstances, but if you're just going to look at the language,
employees are expected
it's sustained. I mean, it's kind of hard to argue that it's not. It seemed pretty black and white.
But in addition to it being a reflection of respect for the community, I think it also is inconsistent with ACPD holding itself to a high standard of conduct and courteousness and respectfulness, where I think, where officers depart from that, and they, our purpose here being to increase and maintain trust with the police department, those are the interactions that somebody walks away with and says that officer was disrespectful or discourteous, and that does a disservice to the community relationship with police, where, I mean, there's a lot in here informing it, and we did talk a lot about, I mean,
Yeah.
In my work, if somebody, starts behaving in a defensive and aggressive manner, not everyone's gonna respond and take the high road. Like, we are humans. It is understandable to have a reaction when your patience has been worn thin and tested and you've been in this situation. Like, I empathize with the frustration. To me, when I'm looking at the policy, I don't know.
And the other thing I always think about is not just the impact on that individual, but anybody who saw it. And I'm not saying that anybody saw it, but the impact it has on the larger society is really bad, because they won't just hold it against that officer, they will hold it against all officers.
Yeah.
And I know that's a really tough job, but that is why it has to be held to standard, because it's so. And so in any case, I mean, I know you believe that. All I'm saying is that when I read this, it just seems to me like they may have had a reason for being upset, but that doesn't change what they said.
Right, and the coming at the end of the interaction almost made it worse, because it sort of summarized, this is how this whole 30 minutes went down, like in a negative way.
Right, and it makes the complainants say to themselves, you see, that's why I was treated this way through the whole thing. That was this person's attitude from the beginning, even if it wasn't.
Well, and
it's just unfortunate.
And interpret that we feel the same about you as then feeling like I'm being, but bias is being exercised against me because.
Also the we, it's not just me, it's all of ACPD. We all feel this way about you. I mean, it just did a disservice to the entire, they feel to the individual, they were just,
taxed by this situation.
But it's.
Right. Okay, yeah, no, I think that makes sense.
He's looking at me.
Yeah.
I will say, I just appreciate the conversation and taking this very carefully in consideration. And however this vote goes, I'm telling you, like, this is one where I'd be like, I get it.
Yeah.
Like I understand. And then the only last piece I'll say is, it's kind of what you said, Julie. We all are human. Are there going to be circumstances when you do see an interaction where someone is repetitively attacking an officer and the officer just says, says something maybe that would quote unquote say unprofessional, but you're going to be like, hey, that officer took a long, prolonged assault and they just said something to just make that stop. And so this is a way of me segueing, saying, I appreciate the conversation that you all are having. And however you vote on this one, I'd be like, yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
Again, it's like, I think that the thing that makes it more difficult is the fact that this person is from a vulnerable population. Because it would be bad if a police officer said something nasty to anybody, but this particularly cuts to the quick for the community at large. I think that's the problem. But I hear you. It's a difficult job. I couldn't imagine having people screaming at me and say things to me. I think I told one of you, I went on a police ride with someone where they pulled over somebody who, had an outstanding warrant, and somebody who first of all, everybody ran over with their phones to film the entire thing. And the second thing is people were screaming at them and cursing at them. And I thought, oh my God. I just want to give them all a pat on the back and shake their hand and say, I appreciate everything you do every day. So, that's why we're tough when something like this happens, because we do appreciate what you do. We know how hard this is. But, that's why you have to hold everybody to a high standard, because it carries for all of you when something like that happens. So.
Right. And then on the tail end, if you walk away feeling like I was justified in the way I behaved because this comment demonstrates that, they were against me from the beginning and yada, 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 then it's not reflective of ACPD's.
The thing I'd like is what you just said, Lisa, about the impact on the officer, which I hope the impact is not the board hates us, because we don't. We're really, I mean, that the whole point is to elevate. And you know, I don't know that any of us would want someone reviewing everything we do every day because second guessing is easy. But the point is on behalf of the community to try to say, look, this is what we're really looking for. And I think it's fair to say in this case, for personal context, the officer fell short.
And also offer the last, or
Yeah, another.
just one other point on the reputation and then also the respectiveness that we want officers' interactions with the community. The reverse is also true, is that an inappropriate comment can also lead to a unintended consequence in officer safety and public safety issue. Is that fair to say that the wrong comment could lead to a heightened aggressive behavior
By a wrong comment by the
by the
officer.
officer towards the
But
person?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, that could be, yeah.
So it could escalate the
Yeah,
behavior of the
sure.
person
Sure.
necessarily.
Yeah, I would say that,
Officer aspect of it, that being courteous and respectful is obviously incredibly important, but it's also a safety issue.
Part of maintaining a non-escalated interaction.
Just not warranted, right?
Right,
Yeah,
we're not eliciting
you're
another.
reinforcing the idea of de-escalation, making sure that we're creating environments and situations where we are bringing the temperature of whatever is going on in a downward direction.
We always want to lower that
Yes.
risk, and
Yeah.
adding additional unnecessary comment increases the risk.
Mhm.
Right, so it just
Yeah,
further.
So we're ready to vote?
Yeah, I'll second Charles's motion.
okay, all in favor of adopting the sustained policy violation for Officer 1, aye?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed, nay? Any abstentions? Okay, duty responsibilities, Officer 1, again, looking at the, justification for the detention, recommendation is to exonerate. Do we have a motion to exonerate?
I'll move to exonerate Officer 1.
Do we need
Duty
discussion?
responsibilities.
Oh, no, you said it.
Okay,
Yeah, we can just
okay.
go ahead and vote.
Yeah, sorry, well, I didn't hear,
Oh.
second the motion?
I'll second.
Okay, all in favor of exonerating Officer 1 on duty responsibilities? Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Aye. Okay. Okay, bias through policing, the recommendation is not sustained. Do I have a motion to adopt the recommendation?
Move to adopt the not sustained recommendation.
All in favor, aye? Aye. Opposed, nay? Any abstentions? No. Okay, I do want to reflect, that I think giving the time to get into this, sometimes there's more material to review and sometimes there's less. But I do think that it's valuable to kind of get into this, especially as these are our first cases, right? And we're kind of getting our hands around the scope of the current policies and the thresholds and the variable factors and the different perspectives. So I do appreciate everyone's kind of patience and participation in digging through that one in detail. So, okay, we're scheduled for a break. It's 8:02. I don't think we have public comment. And so if we don't break, we could hear from the IPA report out. Does anyone want to break? Okay.
I just say, since we're done with this, we'll move on. I am hopeful, especially, since, as we heard from CPD, that, this particular one, especially on point number 1, there's a recognition that this could have, this finding on their part, could have been different. But my hope is that as we keep doing this, that understanding We'll start to permeate through, HPD or PR, that this is how the community is looking at this. So that when we get to these things where there's, we could have looked that there is in that first instance, a reflection of this is the community expectation of how, our, policies should be interpreted, and that we, don't necessarily have to have this, this long, back and forth. Oh, no, well, yeah, I guess I could have seen it,
Sure.
that way. And, and that permeates down to the training, because we do have a lot of those, hours. So it's not that, I don't think after all the time spent at the academy and all that kind of stuff and all that we saw what they do, I don't think any of us would ever say that there's not, the hours aren't there. So then what it becomes is just if we see, certain things continuing, that we take an evaluation of, the quality of what we're getting, of those hours we're getting from those hours, because it only has been since 2021. So a lot of this is new to a lot of people. There's a lot of understandings of how policing should have been done with regard to bias that had to be unlearned or learned for the first time. So this is a new area for a lot of us that's understood. So hopefully, I look forward to what we're doing here, coming to a point where we don't, where things like this, we don't necessarily see, because there's already a common understanding of, how to interpret these policies and the training, make sure that we don't even run into these type of things.
Yeah, well, and I would reflect that I think, the debriefs with ACPD before these meetings aren't part of our, required process, but we are doing them and making time for them as much as we are, because we both benefit from, going through the different perspectives that, like, this is the first time I became aware of, monitoring for pre-assault indicators. So my ability to review the information and have a more complete perspective from multiple participants is certainly heightened. And we've had lots of discussions with Albert about, how do we evaluate where current policy thresholds may need to evolve over time, because there is a consistent community sentiment that, X, Y, and Z. And we know from ACPD taking on lots of kind of proactive policy changes that's part of their organizational culture. And it's certainly been a positive part of our kind of debrief process. So as we continue to kind of build that conversational muscle, I guess that's part of what I'm saying is, we won't always need to go through all of this in so much detail, because we are through this process kind of strengthening our understanding of the policies, the operational, the many, many duties and responsibilities that, the different scenarios you can go from one situation to another, and also the many perspectives of different community members and different circumstances where they may need a higher threshold of empathy because, their defensiveness is not great, but understandable. So I think that's really the value in going through this process in the way that we're structuring it. And we're, adapting these protocols as we go through, because it's a lot of information and it's a lot of time, but it's valuable to be able to broker that shared understanding. And the quicker, getting to, well, it did not occur to me that this is a small space and whatever. And so, I think that muscle is two-sided, and definitely one of our explicit goals in building out the protocols that we have.
Speaking of protocols, I really appreciate the team's effort, Mummy and Captain Kim both. Mummy for providing a very comprehensive follow this procedure and bullet points on review. That is very much a me thing. So much appreciated. And then also for taking the time to go through and capturing the specific areas that are most important through body or camera footage, especially for lengthy reviews. So it's not lost on me that that's an additional logistical effort. So appreciate it.
And timely, because it's often requested, later. So
Thank you, Jim.
Appreciate the diligence going into preparation. It makes our homework a lot easier, if still a little bit high. So
we're going to.
I'm gonna see, we do have participation online, just make the opportunity for public comment. Otherwise, Mummy, if you have any report out updates, we can go to you and then open discussion.
Nothing for me.
Okay, wonderful.
That's quick.
Yeah.
And I just want, because, Captain, because you said Nika's looking at me, and I just want to remember that this is the first word in our board is community. So we're just looking at it from the community side, not to say that you're wrong.
Oh, no,
and us against you. It's just how we see it. And it's not always saying that we're always right, because we don't have the training and the perspective of law enforcement. So when you do give feedback to the officers, it's just that, like, the community sees it this way. How can we bridge the gap? And not that you're wrong or you're not doing your job as adequate as you can. It's just, this is what we see from our perspective. And let's, as stakeholders, come together and bridge that gap. So
That's fair. And thank you.
Community, right?
Also, when he said it, he was looking at me, I think he was saying like, I probably am supposed to weigh in here.
Yeah, I thought, that's what I was saying. I was like, I think he's looking at me like I'm supposed to say something. I was like, okay.
Not like, and you could either, or like, does Captain Kim want to comment?
Yes, that's what I meant by saying that.
You know, I know how we, you know, we do briefs after, and I know, what the chief sees after for as far as our important stuff. In particular, when we have situations where our findings are different than OPR's findings, to what extent will an officer involved be aware of it?
You know, I think we haven't really developed that yet. This particular one, there's probably some follow-up that just needs to be done, just on the back end of this. And I think you brought up this question last time, and that's just not something that we've completely developed yet or have completely thought through. And I think it's going to be situationally dependent, right? So what are we talking about here? Are we talking about exonerated versus not sustained? Are we fundamentally on the same page about something? So it really doesn't require that follow-up. Is there an agreement with the COB that maybe things could have been done a little bit better? And then for the benefit of the agency and the officer, that follow-up is probably something that we should initiate as part of the growth and development of that officer. Those are all things that we sort of need to noodle through, because this, I mean, to be quite honest, it's just, we've only done a few of these, you know, these public hearing meetings, and sort of understanding the perspective of the COB, understanding sort of the points that you're making, and then allowing us to internalize that and develop something situationally dependent. I think that's where we're headed for and directionally.
Well, and to acknowledge that that's also where we are with our protocols, right? Like, we have established a process, and what we're finding is that based on different kinds of cases and different amounts of information, we sometimes have to make changes. So, you know, the goal is for those to become more reliable, predictable. You guys have a full 10 days notice to review, you know, something before we're gonna go through a case, especially the more involved one. So that's my only comment for open discussion, is that we do have some kind of follow-up from our ongoing planning and scheduling and trying to give you guys enough time, while also trying to, you know, address the county's expectation that we be expedient with these. We did reflect in our input to the budget hearing that it is extremely typical for oversight boards to have a backlog. I am not really aware of one that doesn't have a backlog. I'm not going to suggest that I'm familiar with all of the COB's, you know, progress, but I do know that many of them have a substantial backlog, and especially on the front end, what we've talked about. And I think this is, I won't speak for you, but I think this is where we have an area of agreement where we certainly don't want to rush through a case review or an investigation review at the expense of, you know, the reliability of the process. So we would like to get to bring that perspective to the county board and county manager, so that they understand creating time-based expectations that could be seen as arbitrary are counterproductive to the kind of establishment of reliable protocols that give us an opportunity for meaningful, constructive investigation reviews. So that's a conversation we're hoping to having a meeting with them later this month.
We need reps. It's pretty simple.
Yeah.
We need reps.
Yeah. Before we're gonna.
Less than half a dozen.
Yeah. Any other open discussion items? I know Lisa previewed the new data dashboard and we're gonna get an update on that soon. So we're looking forward to that from ACPD. Other than that, I don't know that we have anything upcoming that's otherwise noteworthy.
If anybody else wants to see the dashboard, you can do that. I mean, it's 15 minutes.
I'd love to do it in a meeting. We can schedule time for that if that's good for you.
We're hoping by the end of the month
Sure.
that we'll be ready to push it out, but.
Well, I don't want to be accused of dragging our feet on anything, but I did just say that, you know, getting things right before they go to the public view can be beneficial. While we are, that's not to suggest we're not trying to be expedient with this. We would like that these reps contribute to a response time that makes the community members feel like their concerns are being addressed in a timely manner, but not at the risk of kind of any missteps. So. Any other items? Okay. I declare the meeting adjourned.
All right.
Mommy, thank you so much.
Thank y'all. Great discussion tonight. Appreciate you, Albert and Tosh. And I think I heard Andy. I don't know if he walked out of the room, but thank y'all for joining us.
Do that.
It's really cool. You could do quite a few.
Gotta get some little time back.
With it. It only goes back to 2021. But you know, it's like a map. You can look at different crimes that have been committed in different parts of Arlington, and you can sort it by all kinds of things.
I'm just gonna leave that.
It's the way that they like, you know, like normally.
Right. In the words of Lieutenant Brown.
Ian, you can mute the meeting in the recording.
That's she wants me to say something.
Yeah.
That's good. Call him out.